What up, folks? Thank you for tuning in. Today, we are drawing a mid-engine sports car. So I start the sketch off by laying in the minor and major axis for my ellipses. Start to lay in the wheels, lay in the wheelbase. And that's usually how I start my sketches. Again, there are some people that start off a different way. I like to establish my proportion at the beginning of my sketches. So you'll see I build off of the wheelbase. Now, I think this wheelbase is probably a little bit short. It probably could be a half wheel longer, but this is where we're at. And then I lay in the wheels that are closest to us, and then I block in the wheels on the far side. Here I just ghost it nice and lightly. I'm using a Prismacolor, which is a pretty thick wax. So I don't want to press too hard and then leave an indelible mark, right? So I just kind of ghost that far side in. And then what I've just done is laid in the ground line. So it's kind of like a body kit towards the front. And I'm starting to noodle on the headlights. Maybe there's a circular headlight. Maybe it's some kind of Porsche-esque thing. I haven't really decided. It ends up being a non-branded vehicle, but I was kind of toying with that idea at this point. And there comes a moment in this particular sketch, which is probably like right about here, where I'm like, this is ugly. It's not going anywhere. This is a dog sketch. Pardon my French. And I think like, oh, I'm just gonna quit. I'm gonna restart this sketch because it's too far gone. And then what I realized was that I got too caught up in the details, the little noodles, noodling on the details. So I just needed to loosen up, start to move my hand and get the vehicle blocked in. Right, so this is kind of where that's happening. I'm just moving through the sketch a bit faster. I've stopped thinking so much about what the specific detail is and just gotten to laying in more of the vehicle so that I can see it instead of noodling on the details, because I wasn't liking where the details were going. They just looked weird. And I was like, okay, forget it. I'm just gonna move quickly through this. And in that process of removing my mind from the sketch, it started to come together. And we started to get a shape and a proportion that was feeling a little better than earlier in the sketch, where I was convinced that this was going to be a terrible sketch. So I just had to, again, take my mind out of it and just let your hands go, right? Let your wrist go, just move, just find the flow in the sketch. That's what I had to do. I was getting too tight. I was getting locked into details and they weren't working together because I wasn't seeing the whole picture. So try to get as much of the vehicle blocked in as fast as you can, or as early as you can, so you can get the shapes and proportions. Then you can layer the details in, which is what you see me starting to do here. Right, so now that I have essentially all the volumes built, I worked through the cabin section, through the rear section. Now I'm coming in and tightening up and modifying some of the details that I had started to noodle on earlier. And here I start to really press on that pencil, start to get certain sections to pop out. I've already laid the exoskeleton or the underskeleton or the understructure for it all. So I just start to loosen up and now I really start to flow, and I'm like, all right, I'm just gonna lay in some details here. Again, removing my mind from the process and just allowing the details to pop up and just flow. If I don't like the sketch, I had already committed to throwing the sketch out earlier, so I've got nothing to lose here, right? So I'm just throwing details on and it's like, all right, it's coming together. It's a cool vent up front and starting to define that DLO a little bit more right here. Maybe it tucks in like a Lamborghini, how they have that tuck in behind that window there and they have a little vent. So maybe this is something akin to that, since it is kind of a mid to rear engine proportion. The proportion's a little wonky. Still, I'd probably move the cab a little bit more forward if I were to overlay this, but we're gonna put those vents back there as if it is rear engine or mid engine. And starting to lay in and define that rear wing section kind of coming up. Maybe there's a wing that connects those rear fenders. And the rear fenders are pretty high. And then maybe there's some active aero or something like that. So I've just added those cut lines and those little details there. And then working back to the front. Oftentimes I'll bounce around a sketch. Once I have the essential volumes blocked in and I start laying in the details, sometimes I get to a spot where I'm like, I don't know what to do here. So I'll bounce to a different part of the sketch, work on that, lay in some section lines here for the door, for the side panel, and then I'll move back to the rear later or move back to the front. It's not super formulaic. I will say that this detail that I'm laying in right now, I immediately didn't like. I was like, oh, well, that was a crappy detail. So I try to figure out, oh, well, what do I do now to start to integrate that piece into more of the body? So now it's a thought like, okay, well, maybe it's an event to pull the heat out, and I've just laid in a thicker line along that baseboard to kind of hide some of that weird detail that I added. It was a little too Gundam-esque for the rest of the vehicle, but such is life. We can always do another sketch, but I wouldn't keep that detail in the next iteration. And now I've come in and I'm starting to lay in a bit darker values, especially where those vents are and along the body sides, to start to show some shape, to show some volume, start to illustrate where the surfaces are changing or where the volumes are related to each other. And using the side of the pencil, so sometimes I'll go in for the details and I'll use the tip, right? I'll hold it closer to the tip and I'll lay in a tight detail. When I'm laying in value, right, so as you saw right there, right, using the tip, hand closer to the top. When I'm laying in the value, I'll slide my hand down the pencil and I'll use the side of the pencil to just brush in lightly. And so that way I have a bit more control over the value or the lightness of it when I'm holding the pencil farther away from the tip. I'm not as likely to press hard on it. So I can slowly build up the values by using the side of the Prismacolor. And now here I'm thinking about, oh, maybe that front, that hood shape then kind of is a raised element to start to show a bit more of an aggressive stance. Like those big vents you see on muscle cars and things like that, kind of like that nostril, that schnoz, if you will, kind of gives cars this aggressive look, and it's kind of cool. So I've started to sculpt that shape a bit towards the front of the bonnet there. And again, adding some depth to those vents on the hood. And I'm thinking that I probably want to pull in some more air into this engine that's somewhere back there. So I'm building that little detail in, and I'll come back to it later. And at this point I realize, oh, we've got all this car here, but where are the wheels? Right, so the wheels needed some love. So I'll lay in a bit more value, and I think I end up going with like a pretty simple 5-spoke. In this particular view, you don't have an incredible angle looking at the wheels, so I just kept it simple. Simple 5-spoke, kind of inset, give it a little bit of depth. And I'll go back and I'll do the rear the same thing. And I usually have the rears set in a little bit more, a deeper dish in the rear than in the front. The thinking is that the rear wheels are your drive wheel, so you want to have a little bit more meat or a thicker tire back there. And continuing to add some value right around that front diffuser area, that spoiler area, whatever the technical term might be for that ground effect. And adding some more value so that the top of the hood kind of stands off of the ground effect a bit. And then I work my way back to that rear tire. And again, you can see there's a little bit more depth, a little bit more meat on that rear tire than on the front. And I think that for a sports car, having the wheels, giving the wheels enough impression of mass and of depth is super important, right? To make the vehicles feel planted and feel like a true performance vehicle. If you look at the wheels on a Prius, where it's got the rim essentially at the edge of the wheel, there's no depth and there's very little interest, in my opinion. That's certainly not a sporty look. So here I've gone through, added a little Lexan window. Any good sports car is going to have that little sliding Lexan piece. And working along the center line and continuing to add the detail to clarify what that detail is around that vent for the engine. Adding some more value, defining that center line. And then I'll add a little bit of value on the far side of that center line to show an ever so slight bit of curvature to those top surfaces. Because no surface on a vehicle, generally speaking, is completely flat, including the roof and anything like that. And then I'll go through, add that ground shadow. Well, you know I love the ground shadow because we want our vehicles to feel like they're planted on the ground, unless you're drawing an airplane or something like that. Gives it that sense of volume, sense of mass, sense of presence. The ground shadow is really important. It makes it feel more three-dimensional as well, the sketch. And at this point, I just come in, I tighten up, add some more definition to that wheel opening to make sure that the wheels really stand off the sketch and that they read as a separate part. Add a little bit more depth, a little bit more value, and that brings us home, right? Push in those wheels a little bit by adding some shadow. And in the end, the sketch came out decent. I'm certainly happy with it, considering my initial impression about 3 minutes in. I hope you found some value here. If you did, leave a like, subscribe, drop a comment if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time.